Beneath the trenches of the Eastern Front, another war was being fought in complete silence, a war of hidden explosives, disappearing soldiers, and entire landscapes turned into lethal traps. What if the deadliest battles of World War II weren't fought above ground at all, but in the soil under every advancing boot and tank? This is the story of the conflict millions never saw, but thousands never survived. On the Eastern Front of the Second World War, the confrontation between Germany and the Soviet Union evolved into a conflict defined not only by large-scale offensives and armored breakthroughs, but also by extensive underground warfare. Both armies confronted a battlefield stretching more than 1,600 kilometers, where terrain, climate, and the density of fortified positions made mine warfare and sapper operations a central component of military strategy. Soviet sappers developed tactics for laying mines behind German lines during night operations, targeting supply depots, rail lines, and vehicle parks. German pioneers prepared assault minefields designed to channel Soviet counterattacks into predetermined kill zones. Intelligence estimates from both sides recognize the cumulative impact these underground operations would have on the tempo of the war. A single overlooked anti-tank mine could disable a vehicle column, delay reinforcements, and disrupt operational planning for hours. Military preparedness on both sides depended on the ability of sapper units to adapt to seasonal conditions. During summer, mine-clearing operations were hindered by dust, heat, and rapid vegetation growth that concealed mines. In autumn, mud and flooding buried mines deeper into the soil or exposed them where erosion occurred. Winter conditions introduced new challenges. Frozen ground made excavation extremely time-consuming, while snow concealed mines completely. Soviet records from the winter of 1941 to 42 describe dozens of cases in which German tanks detonated mines buried beneath ice layers that pioneers had been unable to detect. German records describe losses to improvised Soviet charges made from artillery shells, aerial bombs, or even naval mines transported inland for defensive purposes. By the end of 1941, the preconditions for a prolonged underground struggle had fully emerged. Both armies understood that the front would not be decided solely by infantry or armored operations. Instead, it would be shaped by the continuous deployment and clearing of millions of mines, the construction of trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles, and the work of tens of thousands of sappers operating under extreme conditions. This environment established the foundation for the underground war that would unfold across the Eastern Front in the years that followed, defining the tempo, shape, and lethality of the conflict in ways unmatched on any other theater of the war. The opening phase of underground warfare on the Eastern Front emerged simultaneously with the broader clashes that began in June 1941. As German forces advanced rapidly during the initial weeks of Operation Barbarossa, sapper units from both sides were drawn into the front lines sooner than anticipated. German pioneers accompanying the spearheads of army groups north, center, and south were tasked with clearing routes for armored divisions, repairing destroyed bridges, and neutralizing Soviet demolition charges. Soviet engineer units, forced into emergency withdrawal, executed large-scale demolitions across western Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. Between 22 June and 10 July 1941, Soviet sappers destroyed more than 3,800 bridges, ranging from small wooden crossings to major steel structures, significantly slowing German advances in multiple sectors. In the opening month alone, German reports recorded more than 12,000 mine detonations in front of advancing units. Many of these resulted from improvised Soviet devices, including artillery shells buried under road surfaces or connected to pressure triggers. The unpredictability of these systems forced German pioneers to proceed cautiously, probing ground manually while infantry and tanks waited. At the same time, Soviet sapper battalions attempted to delay German progress by laying new minefields behind retreating formations. In some sectors, mine belts were established overnight using limited equipment and locally sourced materials. Records from the 13th Soviet Army describe instances where single battalions laid more than 2,000 mines in under 12 hours, often under direct artillery fire. Key command structures began adjusting their strategies as early as July 1941. German High Command recognized that the pioneering units allocated during the planning of Barbarossa were insufficient for the scale of obstacles encountered. Additional engineer battalions were redeployed from reserve armies, and new directives instructed all infantry divisions to assign personnel for emergency mine-clearing duties. Soviet leadership issued similar adjustments. The Stavka ordered engineer brigades to reorganize into mobile groups capable of retreating quickly while executing coordinated demolitions. The goal was to create a continuous chain of obstacles that would erode the speed of the German advance. Soviet defensive doctrine emphasized the creation of fortified zones supported by deep mine belts, but the rapid collapse of frontline positions forced sappers to work while withdrawing. They destroyed critical infrastructure to deny German forces access to rail and supply routes. German reports indicate that by mid-August, sappers encountered destroyed railway stations, mined warehouses, and booby-trapped administrative buildings in most recently captured towns. Soviet units frequently left mines inside doorways, stairwells, or beneath piles of debris. These delayed action charges caused numerous casualties among German occupation troops during the opening phase of consolidation. At the same time, German pioneers initiated large-scale breaching operations. Clearing mine belts on the frontier required coordinated use of infantry cover, small demolition charges, and specialized tools such as Bangalore torpedoes. However, shortages of these devices forced pioneers to improvise. In many cases, they used grenades or concentrated rifle fire to detonate mines at a distance. Tanks equipped with mine rollers were deployed in limited numbers, but breakdowns and mechanical failures restricted their effectiveness. By late summer 1941, the underground conflict had expanded beyond immediate frontline engagements. German units began encountering Soviet delayed retreat devices, including time-fused charges set to detonate hours or days after occupation. These devices targeted supply dumps, headquarters buildings, and fuel depots, causing operational disruptions across several sectors. For example, on 17 August near Smolensk, a Soviet delayed action charge destroyed a German ammunition storage area containing more than 150 tons of explosives. The blast halted supply operations for the 10th Army Corps and delayed planned advances. The opening phase also established the Soviet practice of mining roads, forests, and riverbanks far ahead of infantry positions. German intelligence learned that Soviet engineers often mined secondary routes rather than main roads, anticipating that German units would attempt flanking maneuvers to bypass destroyed bridges or traffic congestion. As a result, German pioneers were forced to expand clearance operations across broad areas, increasing the manpower and time required to secure logistical pathways. In the south, particularly in Ukraine, underground warfare took on additional dimensions due to vast agricultural regions and river systems. Soviet sappers destroyed irrigation structures, mined embankments along the Dnieper, and prepared demolition points on major river crossings. German pioneers advancing toward Kiev and the Dnieper Bend faced repeated challenges as Soviet engineers executed demolition operations moments before withdrawal. On several occasions, German assault engineers attempted to seize bridges intact, but were forced back by Soviet machines who detonated charges at the last moment. Despite rapid German successes in the opening phase, the continuous presence of mines, booby traps, and demolition zones reduced operational tempo. Panzer divisions recorded delays ranging from 12 to 48 hours due to minefields alone. These constraints, combined with expanding Soviet defensive preparations further east, indicated that underground warfare would become a persistent feature of the conflict. By the end of 1941's opening operations, both sides had adapted to a battlefield where explosives beneath the ground were as decisive as artillery and armor above it. The experience gained across the first months of fighting established the tactical foundations that would guide planning, countermeasures, and large-scale sapper operations throughout the remainder of the Eastern Front campaign. The strategic goals and planning behind mine warfare on the Eastern Front evolved significantly as both German and Soviet commands realized that engineering operations would shape not only tactical engagements, but also the tempo and structure of entire campaigns. By late 1941, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army had developed divergent yet increasingly sophisticated approaches to the deployment, clearance, and coordination of mines. Each side viewed underground warfare as a means to compensate for tactical disadvantages or to reinforce operational strengths. These calculations produced extensive planning frameworks that influenced the character of the conflict from 1942 onward. For Germany, the primary strategic objective in mine warfare during the early phase of the war was the preservation of offensive momentum. German doctrine emphasized rapid breakthroughs supported by armored spearheads, and minefields represented a direct threat to that operational model. As a result, German planners sought to minimize delays by expanding the role of pioneer Truppen. By December 1941, the Army increased its pioneer strength by more than 40%, forming additional battalions specifically tasked with clearing Soviet mine belts. High-level planning documents from Army Groups North, Center, and South stressed the need for integrated engineer support during every major offensive action. These documents mandated that pioneers be positioned close behind the first wave of infantry and armor, equipped to clear mines under fire and repair infrastructure destroyed by retreating Soviet units. Soviet strategic planning, by contrast, placed minefields at the center of a broader doctrine of attrition and depth defense. After suffering severe losses during the initial months of Barbarossa, the Red Army reorganized its engineering forces into larger formations, engineer brigades and assault engineer sapper brigades. These units were designed to support both defensive and offensive operations. Soviet doctrine published in early 1942 emphasized the creation of multi-layered defensive zones supported by dense mine belts between 400 and 1,000 meters deep. Strategic planners projected that such belts could delay German mechanized formations for several hours or even days, allowing reserves to regroup and reinforcing units to arrive. Soviet mining operations increasingly coordinated with artillery and anti-tank defenses to create interlocking zones in which minefields served as the first trigger for prepared ambushes. Logistically, both sides engaged in mass production and widespread distribution of mines. Between 1942 and 1943, Soviet factories produced millions of anti-tank mines such as the TM-35, TM-41, and later TM-44, along with anti-personnel devices like the PMD-6 and OZM series fragmentation mines. Germany, facing intense fighting on multiple fronts, expanded production of Teller mines, S-mines, and a series of anti-personnel pressure devices. Ukrainian and Belarusian forests, urban ruins, and open steppes became heavily contaminated as commanders on both sides used mines to shape movement, weaken attacking formations, and protect supply lines. Strategic planning also began incorporating mine warfare into offensive operations. Soviet planners recognized that minefields could be used not only defensively, but also proactively during counteroffensives. Beginning in 1942, Soviet sappers regularly laid mines behind advancing German units, creating pursuit traps designed to delay reinforcements or hinder German withdrawals. Records from the Bryansk and Voronezh fronts detail mining operations executed within 12 to 24 hours of capturing territory, preventing German units from launching immediate counterattacks. German countermeasures included the deployment of reconnaissance elements trained to identify likely sapper infiltration routes, the use of tripwire detection devices, and the expansion of night patrols to prevent Soviet engineers from planting mines close to German positions. Both armies made significant miscalculations in their mine warfare planning. German planners underestimated the speed at which the Red Army could mobilize engineer brigades and establish new defensive lines after major retreats. This miscalculation contributed to delays during Operation Blue in 1942 as German spearheads encountered larger and more sophisticated mine belts than expected. Soviet planners, on the other hand, initially underestimated German proficiency in clearing minefields. Pioneer battalions developed advanced clearance techniques, including coordinated use of explosive line charges, flail tanks in later stages of the war, and remote detonation systems. These techniques allowed German forces to breach mine belts more quickly than anticipated, reducing the intended delays. Propaganda on both sides highlighted the importance of engineering troops. German military publications emphasized the bravery of pioneers clearing mines under fire and portrayed them as essential to the progress of the Eastern Campaign. Soviet propaganda promoted engineers as defenders of the motherland, who used mines to counter German technological superiority. Training manuals distributed to both armies stressed discipline, technical knowledge, and the strategic significance of underground warfare. By 1943, mine warfare planning was fully integrated into major operations. During the Battle of Kursk, for example, Soviet command deployed more than 500,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines across the defensive belts of the Central and Voronezh fronts. German intelligence estimated the density of mines at up to 1,500 per kilometer in some sectors. German planning documents for Operation Citadel assigned dozens of pioneer battalions to breaching tasks, anticipating severe mine-related delays. These estimates proved accurate, as minefields played a decisive role in slowing German armored advances in the opening hours of the battle. Strategic goals surrounding mine warfare on the Eastern Front thus evolved through continuous adaptation and counter-adaptation. Both sides recognized that mines could alter the course of operations by shaping movement, channeling attacks, and inflicting steady attrition. By the time the war entered its middle phase, mine warfare had become one of the most essential components of planning on both sides, influencing not only tactical engagements, but also the operational decisions that defined the broader conflict. The first major clashes shaped by mine warfare and sapper operations unfolded during the large-scale offensives and counteroffensives of 1942 and 1943, when both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army confronted the increasing lethality and density of engineered obstacles across the Eastern Front. As German forces attempted to maintain momentum after the initial successes of 1941, they encountered deeper, more organized Soviet defensive belts, reinforced with extensive minefields, anti-tank ditches, wire obstacles, and fortified strongpoints. Soviet engineers, drawing on lessons from the early stages of the war, established defensive zones in depth, often supported by multiple rows of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. German pioneers reported mine densities of 800 to 1,200 devices per kilometer in several sectors in early 1942, a sharp increase from the previous year. During the German drive toward the Caucasus in mid-1942, sappers on both sides engaged in continuous operations. Soviet units executed large-scale demolitions of bridges, railways, and roads in the Don and Kuban regions, creating significant delays for German mechanized formations. German pioneer battalions were forced to deploy around the clock, clearing mines, repairing bridges, and stabilizing captured infrastructure under constant threat from Soviet artillery. In July 1942, German engineers documented more than 20 major demolitions on the approaches to Rostov alone, each requiring several hours to clear, often under fire. These operations slowed the advance of German units by up to 2 days, demonstrating the tactical effect of coordinated sapper activity. The Soviet counteroffensive during the Battle of Stalingrad introduced new dimensions to underground warfare. As German units entrenched themselves in urban ruins, Soviet sappers used mines to disrupt supply routes, military depots, and assembly areas. Engineer units laid thousands of mines inside buildings, across stairwells, and beneath rubble. German pioneers clearing these environments reported high casualty rates due to booby traps designed to detonate with minimal disturbance. Soviet accounts describe mining operations carried out at night, with small sapper groups infiltrating frontline positions to establish improvised explosives triggered by pressure or tripwires. These devices contributed to the attrition of German infantry operating in narrow streets and ruined structures. German forces also employed extensive mine barriers around their defensive positions at Stalingrad. During the Soviet encirclement phase in November 1942, German units withdrew behind hastily organized lines, reinforced with thousands of anti-personnel mines. However, these measures failed to prevent the Soviet 62nd and 64th Armies from closing the ring, as Soviet engineers cleared paths under fire to enable infantry assaults. Soviet military records note that engineer losses during mine-clearing operations around Stalingrad exceeded 2,000 personnel in less than a month, reflecting the intensity of the fighting. Territorial shifts in 1943 triggered further escalation in mine warfare. The advancing Red Army during the winter counteroffensives encountered German rearguard minefields designed to slow pursuit. German pioneers increasingly used delayed fuse charges attached to bridge supports, rail intersections, and fuel depots. When detonated, these devices produced significant disruptions in Soviet logistics. For example, during the Soviet advance toward Kharkiv in February 1943, German demolition teams destroyed several key bridges over the Udi and Lopan rivers, forcing Soviet sappers to improvise temporary crossings. These operations delayed Soviet armored movements by up to 36 hours, providing German infantry time to reorganize defensive positions. The opening stages of the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented the most concentrated clash involving mine warfare during the entire Eastern Front campaign. Soviet engineers constructed multiple defensive belts across approximately 300 kilometers of front, laying more than 500,000 anti-tank mines and over 400,000 anti-personnel mines. German pioneers encountered dense mine belts supported by anti-tank guns, artillery, and infantry trenches. Reports from the 9th Army and the 4th Panzer Army recorded hundreds of tank and vehicle losses to mines within the first 2 days of the offensive. In one sector near Poniri, German units detonated more than 5,000 mines in a single morning as panzers attempted to breach Soviet defenses. The unexpected intensity of these minefields forced German commanders to pause and reorganize breaching operations. Pioneer units created narrow corridors through Soviet belts, often only 4 to 6 meters wide, through which assault formations attempted to advance. These corridors became predictable targets for Soviet artillery, resulting in additional casualties. The effectiveness of Soviet sapper preparation contributed directly to the stalled German momentum during the opening phase of the Kursk operation. Clashes also unfolded behind the front lines. Soviet engineer sabotage groups targeted German supply depots, rail lines, and command posts. In 1943 alone, Soviet sappers recorded more than 9,000 sabotage operations behind German lines, including mine-laying missions that destroyed trains, fuel dumps, and ammunition storage sites. German occupation authorities documented the loss of dozens of locomotives and hundreds of rail cars due to mines placed on tracks by Soviet partisans and engineer units. These disruptions forced German logistics officers to dedicate additional security to railways, reducing resources available for frontline operations. Across the Eastern Front, the first large-scale engagement shaped by underground warfare revealed patterns that would persist for the remainder of the conflict. Minefields slowed offensives, disrupted supply lines, inflicted significant losses on armored units, and forced both sides to increase investment in sapper training and equipment. The clashes of 1942 and 1943 demonstrated that the underground dimension of warfare could decisively influence the outcome of battles, alter operational plans, and impose continuous attrition on both armies. These early confrontations transformed mine warfare from a supporting tactic to one of the defining features of the Eastern Front, influencing planning, troop allocation, and the conduct of major operations on a scale seen on no other front of the war. The escalation of mine warfare on the Eastern Front reached its height during the campaigns of late 1943 and 1944, when both German and Soviet commands intensified their reliance on underground operations to compensate for shifting strategic conditions. As Soviet forces transitioned from defensive operations to sustained offensives following the victory at Kursk, mine warfare entered a new phase characterized by mass deployment, rapid adaptation, and continuous countermeasures. German formations, increasingly forced into retreat, relied on mines to delay Soviet advances and protect withdrawing units, while Soviet engineers expanded their offensive mining efforts to disrupt German logistics and reinforce their own breakthroughs. The scale of these operations produced significant casualties, logistical strain, and new challenges in command coordination on both sides. By late 1943, the Red Army's engineering forces had expanded significantly. Soviet military reports from the Kalinin, Western, and Steppe fronts show that engineer brigades deployed more than 1.2 million mines during the October-December period alone. These mines were not confined to defensive belts. They were placed along river crossings, forest paths, likely German retreat routes, and in areas expected to be contested during upcoming offensives. As the Soviet advance progressed across Ukraine and Belarus, sapper units frequently moved ahead of infantry formations to prepare demolition traps designed to hinder German counterattacks. These operations often occurred within hours of capturing new ground, demonstrating the speed with which Soviet engineers adapted their methods to a fluid front. German forces, facing increasing pressure across multiple sectors, responded by expanding their use of rearguard minefields. During the retreat from the Dnieper in late 1943, German pioneer battalions deployed hundreds of thousands of mines across key approach routes, bridges, and urban sectors. Reports from Army Group South indicate that during November alone, German engineers placed more than 200,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines while withdrawing from positions near Kremenchuk and Dnipropetrovsk. These rearguard minefields served to delay Soviet pursuit by forcing sappers to conduct extensive clearance operations under fire. In several cases, these delays allowed German infantry and armor to avoid encirclement, though at significant cost to both sides. Terrain and weather conditions contributed to the crisis phase of underground warfare. The autumn Rasputitsa of 1943 transformed roads into deep mud, burying mines or displacing them from their original positions. German pioneers reported difficulty charting previously placed devices because shifting soil created unpredictable patterns of detonation. Soviet sappers faced similar difficulties during clearance operations, as waterlogged ground made probing hazardous and manually lifting mines nearly impossible. Winter conditions, particularly in early 1944, compounded these problems. Frozen soil required explosives or heavy tools to excavate mines. Snow concealed visual indicators, and shifting ice threatened to dislodge devices along river crossings. As a result, casualty rates among engineer units increased significantly during this period. The Soviet offensives of 1944, including Operation Bagration, introduced new complexities into mine warfare. Soviet planning documents for Bagration indicated the deployment of more than 500,000 mines in the weeks leading up to the June launch. These devices served both defensive and offensive functions, shielding Soviet assembly areas and protecting newly formed bridgeheads, while also targeting German supply convoys, reinforcement routes, and communication nodes. Soviet engineer brigades attached to the 1st Belarusian and 1st Baltic fronts executed mining operations across several hundred kilometers of front, often placing small, concealed minefields in forests, ravines, and abandoned structures behind German lines. German responses to the Soviet 1944 offensives reflected the increasing strain on pioneer units. Retreating formations relied heavily on remote detonation devices designed to destroy bridges and infrastructure at precise moments. During the collapse of Army Group Center, German pioneers executed more than 3,000 documented demolitions, including bridges spanning the Berezina, Niemen, and Daugava rivers. These operations temporarily slowed the Soviet advance, but the Red Army's engineering capacity had grown to such an extent that many crossings were restored within hours. Soviet records note the construction of over 100 temporary bridges during the first week of Operation Bagration alone, demonstrating the escalating technical capabilities of Soviet sappers. The escalation phase also exposed both armies to severe command and control challenges. The complexity of coordinating mine deployment and clearance required precise communication between frontline commanders, engineer units, and logistical officers. German withdrawal doctrine, which depended heavily on pre-planned demolition schedules, often broke down under pressure when communication networks collapsed. Radio intercepts, artillery strikes, and rapid Soviet advances sometimes triggered premature demolitions or left infrastructure intact. Soviet command faced similar difficulties during major offensives. Rapid movements of armored units occasionally outpaced sapper support, resulting in vehicles striking undetected German mines and suffering losses that slowed operational momentum. Casualties among sapper units reached significant levels during this period. Soviet sources indicate that engineer brigades attached to the Third Belarusian Front suffered more than 20,000 killed or wounded during the 1944 offensives, much of it linked to mine-clearing operations conducted under direct fire. German pioneer units faced comparable attrition, particularly during the defense of Romania and Hungary, where the terrain favored extensive mine deployment but exposed clearing units to concentrated artillery and small arms fire. International observers, including Allied intelligence branches, noted the growing scale of underground warfare on the Eastern Front. Captured documents and field reports provided detailed accounts of mining patterns, casualty figures, and the technical evolution of engineer equipment. Western analysts recognized that the Eastern Front's mine warfare had reached a scale unprecedented in previous conflicts, both in terms of total mines deployed and the intensity of sapper operations. By the end of 1944, the escalation phase had revealed the limits of mine warfare as both a defensive and offensive tool. While minefields inflicted significant losses and delayed operations at critical moments, neither side could rely solely on underground methods to alter the strategic course of the war. The continuous expansion of sapper roles, the increasing sophistication of devices, and the growing complexity of clearance operations set the stage for the final and most intense phase of mine warfare as the front shifted toward German territory in early 1945. The peak of mine warfare on the Eastern Front emerged during the final year of the conflict, when both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army faced their most demanding operational conditions. As Soviet offensives pushed steadily westward in early 1945, underground operations became essential for shaping the tempo of combat, protecting advancing formations, and disrupting German defensive preparations. At the same time, German pioneer units attempted to compensate for severe manpower shortages and shrinking defensive depth by constructing increasingly dense mine belts, fortified strongpoints, and demolition zones designed to break Soviet momentum. The combination of large-scale offensives, compressed front lines, and collapsing logistical networks produced the most intense mine warfare of the entire campaign. In January 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive demonstrated the full integration of Soviet engineer operations into high-tempo, deep-penetration strategy. Soviet military reports from the First Ukrainian and First Belarusian fronts recorded the deployment of more than 300,000 mines in the preparatory phase, primarily to shield forward assembly areas and protect flanks during the initial breakthroughs. As the offensive began, engineer sapper battalions constructed crossings over the Vistula, clearing German minefields under artillery fire. German pioneers defending the region had laid multiple belts of anti-tank mines, often 600 to 1,200 devices per kilometer, along with booby-trapped buildings and pre-wired demolitions. However, the rapid Soviet advance rendered many of these preparations ineffective, as German units lacked the time to coordinate detonations or guide Soviet forces into kill zones. Nonetheless, scattered German minefields inflicted delays on advancing armored columns, particularly in forested regions around Radom and Tomaszów Mazowiecki. German defensive efforts reached their apex in East Prussia and Pomerania, where pioneer units attempted to construct layered defensive systems reminiscent of earlier stages of the war. Mine belts surrounded towns such as Königsberg, Elbing, and Pillau, supported by trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles. German engineers deployed numerous remote detonation devices, using electric triggers to destroy bridges once Soviet units approached. In some cases, these demolitions succeeded in slowing Soviet progress, but the Red Army's engineering capacity had grown to such an extent that destroyed crossings were frequently replaced within 10 to 24 hours. For example, during the assault on Königsberg in April 1945, Soviet sappers built more than 70 temporary bridges across canals and rivers, while clearing extensive minefields that had been laid by German defenders in the preceding months. Urban combat during this phase amplified the role of mine warfare. As fighting reached major cities such as Budapest, Breslau, and eventually Berlin, both armies deployed mines inside buildings, on staircases, in rubble piles, and along subterranean routes such as sewers and tunnels. German forces in Budapest laid thousands of mines to protect key administrative buildings, bridges, and intersections. Soviet engineers reported that mine clearing in Budapest often required crawling through rubble under sniper fire, with many devices rigged to detonate upon minimal disturbance. During the final fighting in Berlin, German defenders used mines to block Soviet infantry advancing through subway tunnels and underground corridors. Soviet sappers countered these tactics by employing flame projectors, demolition charges, and rapid response mining teams to neutralize interior defenses. Mine warfare also influenced major rural engagements during this peak phase. In Silesia and the Oder-Neisse region, German pioneers attempted to compensate for reduced troop strength by constructing extensive mine belts along defensive lines such as the Steinau and Glogau positions. These belts often combined anti-tank mines, anti-personnel devices, and improvised charges built from artillery shells and aerial bombs. German reports from March 1945 recorded the deployment of more than 150,000 mines in Upper Silesia alone. Soviet engineers clearing these obstacles frequently operated under continuous artillery fire, with some engineer brigades suffering hundreds of casualties in single-day operations. The strain on command coordination intensified on both sides as operations grew more compressed. German pioneer battalions often lacked sufficient equipment or explosives to execute planned demolitions. Fuel shortages limited the mobility of engineer units, while communication breakdowns caused premature detonations or failed demolition attempts. Soviet commands, operating across rapidly shifting front lines, sometimes struggled to maintain contact between forward sapper teams and supporting armored or infantry formations. Delays in clearance operations occasionally forced Soviet tank units to halt, exposing them to German artillery or counterattacks. Civilian suffering also increased significantly during this peak phase. As the front passed through densely populated regions, evacuating civilians encountered extensive minefields that had been laid hastily during retreats. Reports from East Prussian villages describe incidents in which civilians attempting to flee along forest paths or agricultural roads triggered mines intended for Soviet pursuit forces. Soviet archives likewise note civilian casualties in recently liberated areas where German rearguard units had deployed booby traps inside abandoned homes, barns, and public buildings. Despite these challenges, Soviet sapper capabilities reached their highest level of efficiency in 1945. Engineer units were equipped with improved mine detectors, explosive line charges, and specialized clearance tools. Training reforms introduced in 1943-44 produced experienced sapper cadres capable of executing complex mine-clearing operations under combat conditions. Soviet records from the Vistula Oder and Berlin operations cite hundreds of minefields cleared within hours, enabling rapid continuation of major offensives. German pioneer units, although highly skilled, operated under extreme constraints during this period. Their resources were depleted, their numbers reduced, and their defensive positions increasingly isolated. Even when minefields successfully delayed Soviet advances, the Wehrmacht often lacked sufficient reserves to exploit the temporary advantage. As a result, mine warfare in 1945 functioned more as a means of imposing attrition on Soviet forces than as a tool for altering the strategic situation. By May 1945, the underground war had reached its culmination. The intensity, scale, and speed of sapper operations had surpassed all previous phases of the conflict, reflecting the collapse of German defensive capacity and the accelerating advance of Soviet formations. With the capitulation of Germany, the peak of mine warfare came to an abrupt end, leaving behind vast regions contaminated with millions of mines and unexploded charges that would pose dangers for years after the fighting ceased. Soviet and German forces entered the final stages of the conflict with sapper units that had become indispensable to every major operation. Soviet infantry units received brief training in basic mine removal to supplement engineer battalions when needed, a measure that allowed sappers to focus on more complex tasks, such as neutralizing booby traps, demolitions, or multi-layered defenses. German forces, despite suffering heavy losses and facing severe shortages, continued to innovate in an attempt to slow Soviet advances. Pioneer battalions developed new mine-laying patterns intended to mislead Soviet clearance teams. Irregularly spaced minefields, clusters of mixed anti-tank and anti-personnel devices, and dummy mine belts were used to force Soviet engineers to proceed cautiously. German commanders increased their use of low-metal mines, which were difficult to detect with Soviet mine detectors relying on electromagnetic principles. Devices such as wooden Schützenminen and minimal metal Tellermine variants posed significant challenges and required time-consuming manual detection. By 1945, some divisions recorded sapper companies reduced to fewer than 30% of their original manpower, forcing commanders to deploy infantry units for basic engineering tasks. The psychological toll was compounded by fatigue. Continuous operations, night missions, and extended periods spent in mine-infested terrain eroded morale. German accounts describe sapper teams collapsing from exhaustion after attempting to complete demolition preparations while under constant Soviet pressure. In Soviet units, equipment shortages, particularly in mine detectors and protective gear, forced engineers to rely heavily on physical endurance and improvisation. Despite these challenges, both armies maintained operational effectiveness through expanded training programs, rotating sapper units when possible, and increasing the use of supporting technologies. Adaptation also extended to logistical organization. The need for adaptability drove experimentation with new tools, including simplified mine probes, compact explosive charges, flamethrower-based clearance methods, and early variants of mechanized breaching devices. By early 1945, resistance and adaptation had defined the final phase of underground warfare on the Eastern Front. Both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army demonstrated remarkable ingenuity under extreme pressure. Yet despite the tactical successes achieved through these measures, neither side could escape the broader strategic trajectory of the conflict. German innovation slowed but could not halt Soviet advances, while Soviet adaptation enabled rapid breakthroughs, but at significant human and material cost. The continuous cycle of laying, clearing, and countermining shaped every major engagement as the war approached its decisive turning points. The destruction of Army Group Center created a strategic rupture that minefields alone could not mitigate. German pioneer units, already understrength, attempted to re-establish defensive zones along the Berezina and Niemen rivers using anti-tank mines, booby traps, and timed demolition charges. However, the speed of the Soviet advance left little opportunity for coordinated mining. German records from the remnants of the Fourth Army indicate that some minefields were deployed with only a fraction of planned density, sometimes not exceeding 200 mines per kilometer. Soviet engineers exploited this gap, breaching weakly prepared zones in hours rather than days. The failure to reconstruct effective underground defenses signaled a broader collapse in German operational planning. Soviet breakthroughs in Poland in early 1945 further demonstrated the shifting momentum. During the Vistula-Oder offensive, Soviet sappers encountered minefields of varying quality. Some sectors contained dense, well-organized belts with several hundred devices per kilometer, while others had only scattered mines laid hastily during German withdrawal. German pioneer battalions had lost much of their mobility due to fuel shortages, forcing them to abandon pre-planned demolition schedules. In several cases, bridges wired with explosives could not be destroyed because the detonating equipment had been damaged during bombardment or removed to supply other sectors. Soviet forces exploited these failures to cross critical river barriers intact, accelerating the collapse of German defensive cohesion. A decisive moment unfolded during the Soviet offensive into East Prussia in January 1945. German defenders attempted to recreate layered defensive systems reminiscent of earlier years, but shortages in explosives, manpower, and transport made it impossible to sustain large-scale mine warfare. However, Soviet engineers systematically cleared routes, often under direct fire, and by early February 1945, the improvised defenses were unable to slow the final assaults. The destruction of the city's last bridges over the Danube delayed Soviet forces only briefly. Similar patterns unfolded in Königsberg and Breslau, where German minefields inflicted casualties, but failed to alter the strategic trajectory of the fighting. Another significant turning point occurred as Soviet forces approached the Oder River. German pioneers attempted to establish a major defensive line with dense mine belts supported by fortifications. However, logistical collapse made it impossible to sustain the density required for such a barrier. Soviet engineers recorded several sections of the Oder defenses containing fewer mines than anticipated, with many devices malfunctioning due to moisture, freezing conditions, or damaged detonation systems. Instead, both Soviet and newly established local authorities faced one of the largest post-conflict clearance tasks in modern history, as mines, booby traps, and delayed action demolitions continued to cause casualties long after combat ended. During the final months of the war, German pioneer units attempted to execute extensive demolition operations to slow Soviet occupation forces. Bridges, fuel depots, railway yards, and industrial facilities were wired with explosives, though many charges were abandoned or detonated prematurely due to collapsing command structures. In some cases, German engineers successfully executed large-scale demolitions that temporarily disrupted Soviet occupation plans. For example, in late April 1945, German forces detonated charges beneath key bridges in Mecklenburg and Saxony in an attempt to impede Soviet logistical routes. Civilians attempting to return to their homes or gather scattered possessions encountered mine belts left behind by retreating German units. Soviet reports from May and June 1945 documented numerous incidents in which families traveling along forest paths or former frontline roads triggered anti-personnel devices. Displaced populations migrating westward or eastward passed through areas still saturated with unexploded mines. Efforts to direct traffic along cleared routes were implemented by Soviet military authorities, but the sheer size of the contaminated area made comprehensive control difficult. The handling of abandoned munitions and unexploded ordnance created additional risks. Depots left intact during German retreat often contained artillery shells and bombs rigged with delayed action charges. Soviet occupation forces inspecting these sites sometimes triggered explosions accidentally. In several cases, abandoned warehouses collapsed due to concealed demolition charges or unstable ammunition stacks. Such incidents led to increased caution among Soviet logisticians, who implemented strict inspection protocols before occupying or repurposing German facilities. Military withdrawal and surrender processes were also impacted by underground hazards. German units attempting to capitulate in early May often passed through mine belts they had established earlier in the war. Soviet commanders had to allocate engineer support to inspect routes for surrendering troops, preventing additional casualties and ensuring the safe transfer of prisoners. Documentation from the Second Belarusian Front describes multiple incidents in which surrendering German soldiers warned Soviet officers of minefields that had not been mapped or marked, enabling sappers to neutralize them before further movement occurred. Infrastructure reconstruction began almost immediately after hostilities ended, but mine contamination slowed progress. Railway repair units had to work closely with engineers to clear tracks, depots, and switching yards. The restoration of critical transportation routes along the Vistula, Oder, and Elbe required weeks of coordinated clearance. In East Prussia, Soviet occupation forces reported that mine contamination delayed the reconstruction of port facilities in Königsberg and Pillau. These ports were vital for shipping materials and personnel, and engineer units were required to conduct thorough inspections of docks, cranes, warehouses, and nearby access roads before reopening them. The social consequences of mine contamination were profound. In some regions, local populations avoided forests, abandoned agricultural fields, or temporarily relocated villages because of persistent underground dangers. Soviet authorities implemented public awareness campaigns through radio broadcasts, posters, and local meetings to inform civilians of known minefields and to instruct them on avoiding suspicious objects. School teachers in newly reopened schools were instructed to warn children about mines and unexploded ordnance. Despite these efforts, casualties continued, particularly among children and farmers engaged in early post-war reconstruction activities. By the end of 1945, the underground war had transitioned from a combat function to a massive logistical and humanitarian challenge. Soviet engineering units, supported by POW labor and local authorities, faced years of work ahead. The war had left behind one of the most heavily mined landscapes in the world, and the process of neutralizing its dangers became a central task of the immediate post-war period. German pioneers had demonstrated considerable ingenuity under resource constraints, particularly during the final years of the war. Their use of improvised devices, multi-layered mine belts, and remote detonation systems informed later studies on rearguard tactics and defensive delay operations. However, the ultimate strategic failure of mine-based defensive systems underscored the limitations of relying on fixed obstacles in the face of superior mobility, engineering capacity, and sustained combined arms pressure. The political consequences of mine warfare emerged during the early Cold War, as newly formed Eastern Bloc states grappled with the legacy of wartime contamination. Governments in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the Baltic republics were required to implement large-scale clearance programs under Soviet supervision. These programs absorbed significant resources at a time when national economies were already strained by wartime destruction. Reports from Poland in the early 1950s documented the clearance of more than 14 million mines, while East German records listed more than 2 million mines removed from agricultural and forested regions. In some rural areas, clearance efforts continued into the 1960s, illustrating the enduring scope of the problem. The social and cultural impact of underground warfare was profound. Thousands of civilians were killed or injured by mines in the years following the war, particularly in regions where front lines had remained static for long periods, and where both armies had deployed extensive defensive systems. Local communities developed collective memories associated with minefields, often recalling specific areas as dangerous zones long after official clearance reports declared them safe. Folklore, local warnings, and unofficial maps circulated in many villages, reflecting a persistent awareness of hidden wartime dangers. Culturally and historically, mine warfare contributed to debates about the conduct of operations on both sides. Soviet accounts emphasized the skill and sacrifice of engineer sapper brigades as essential to the liberation of occupied territories. Post-war documentaries and military histories highlighted the role of mines in slowing German offensives and protecting Soviet forces during critical periods. In contrast, West German historiography examined the role of pioneer units in delaying Soviet advances, protecting retreating formations, and attempting to stabilize collapsing fronts. These differing perspectives reflected broader narratives about responsibility, resistance, and the nature of warfare on the Eastern Front. Internationally, the legacy of mine warfare influenced early efforts toward the regulation of landmine use. Although global treaties restricting anti-personnel mines emerged decades later, the experiences of Eastern Europe provided early evidence of the long-term humanitarian and economic costs associated with extensive mine deployment. Soviet and Eastern European representatives at international forums frequently cited the lingering contamination as an argument for stricter regulation, even as both NATO and Warsaw Pact states continued to incorporate mines into their Cold War doctrines. The environmental consequences of underground warfare also became apparent in the post-war decades. Forested regions in Belarus and Western Russia saw reduced wildlife populations due to mine detonations and the presence of unexploded ordnance. Agricultural land remained underutilized in some sectors until extensive surveys confirmed the removal of mines. Soil disturbance from explosions, erosion, and clearance operations altered riverbanks and drainage patterns in affected areas. It shaped strategies, influenced tactical decisions, and left behind a dangerous legacy that endured long after the guns fell silent. The underground war represented not only a technical dimension of military conflict, but also a humanitarian and environmental challenge that echoed through the post-war period. Its legacy underscores the enduring impact of wartime decisions on subsequent generations, reminding historians and policymakers alike that the hidden layers of conflict often persist long after battlefields have faded from view.